He's a great drama.
Played golf yesterday and
his cinematography.
today's the class and
Yeah.
tonight's dinner.
Did she win? Did she beat you at golf?
Not yet.
She's
working on it.
Of this week on sport and religion, and was really the inspiration for the development of this course was the fact that Amos Alonzo Stagg came to Chautauqua for several summers between 1888 and 1892. When I started work on my dissertation, and all week I've said this repeatedly, that historians start at one point, and instead of going forward, they frequently have to go backwards further and further and further. So I was introduced to Stagg's papers, a voluminous collection at the University of Chicago, and I intended to write a dissertation on sport and higher education at the turn of the century, using Stagg's career at the University of Chicago. And Stagg had, for all intents and purposes, really brought football west. Hi, Elfrida. Come on in. This is Elfrida Irwin, and one of the reasons I'm here at Chautauqua, she's the archivist here, and she and I corresponded probably starting over 10 years ago. And
Here we go.
she has been quite great.
Frida, we saved this for you. Greetings, how are you?
That's right.
Good to see you.
Right here.
Oh, Frida, no, you're
Right,
not
no,
the way.
no. Right here. Pull it forward.
Elfrida, that means you have to stay, though, if you sit in the front row. But if you ever have, and I know most of you know Elfrida, but any questions about Chautauqua and beyond, visit her in the archives, because we've developed a friendship over the years through correspondence, and then the first time that I came up. Unfortunately, this week I've been so busy, it's the first time I haven't gotten to the archive. But nevertheless, that I started here wanting to look at football and higher education at the turn of the century, and really the explosion of big-time intercollegiate athletics, looking at football and Stagg. Well, I get to his papers, and I discover, well, I certainly knew he attended Yale, but I did not know that he, in between Yale and the University of Chicago, had attended Springfield College. And that was the school that was affiliated with the YMCA, and part of its mission, a significant part of its mission, was to train directors of local YMCAs and gymnasiums in with science/Christian values. It was a scientific approach to education, but combined the Christianity and the science. And again, part of the mission, it was felt that these YMCAs and the gymnasiums and directors of these activities had to come, or should come, from a Christian background. So we looked, Springfield College, that was kind of a surprise. And then I find out and discover Chautauqua, that Stagg had stayed here for several summers, as I said, from 1888 to 1892. One of the reasons I believe that this is somewhat of a hidden chapter in Stagg's background has to do with the link, or what brought him here to Chautauqua. And at Yale, he was a student of William Rainey Harper, who was teaching biblical studies, a very renowned scholar, very young man. And it also, you might know that William Rainey Harper was the first president of the University of Chicago and was responsible for bringing Stagg to Chicago. Well, while they're at Yale, Harper was, in my research, he's acknowledged as the first president of the Chautauqua University, which was different from the summer programming that they did. It was a year-round reading and course that you could take correspondence-wise that could be applied towards a BS or a BA. So Harper had strong connections with Chautauqua from 1883 to 1892 when he goes to the University of Chicago. So he, I'm fairly confident, recruited many Yale students, a lot of athletes came here to come with him to Chautauqua in the summers. So that was the link that got Stagg here. But, and we talked about this yesterday in class, Harper it is pretty well acknowledged that he did not recognize or ever acknowledge the influence that Chautauqua had on the University of Chicago and its organization. Stagg in his autobiography doesn't mention Chautauqua, and so I think that a lot of the documentation is missing or has to be dug up. So this was kind of a hidden chapter and certainly a surprise, but what was so significant or important to me was how it fit in to the late 19th century, to the athletic Christianity, as one journalist coined this era and phrase and activities of Stagg and his peers, and really tied it in nicely with the muscular Christianity that arose in the 1850s and really was manifest not only in Victorian culture or Protestant culture, but specifically on college campuses, and where you see that athleticism and what is often called the sports revolution of the 1880s. So I wanted to give you a general overview, and I want to spend some time on Stagg's background as well to kind of bring us up to how he fit in to Chautauqua specifically, but also this larger emphasis, particularly with Yale, Springfield College, and Chautauqua, that really marrying or integrating athleticism and Christianity. Researching Stagg's life was full of surprises. More so, I think they were pleasant surprises, certainly, but I just had no idea what I was going to uncover. And Stagg, there's a whole kind of mythology around Stagg that talks about his humble origins, modest origins, and fitting into that Horatio Alger, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, self-made man. And what I found is that much of the lore or the mythology that surrounds Stagg's origins really underestimates what really he came out of to become such a preeminent figure in intercollegiate sport, in athleticism. His father, Amos Lindsay Stagg, and this is what took me back to Orange, New Jersey, and looking at the early records of Orange and records from the Census Bureau. His father's name was Amos Lindsay Stagg, and he was bound out as a pauper in Orange, New Jersey by the overseers of the poor in the township of Orange. This was a major concern and preoccupation over the town's elders, and certainly not just in Orange, New Jersey, but what to do with people, and we are dealing with the same issues today, with those that are dependent on the community, who are paupers, as they refer to them then. And there's no real record of where Stagg's grandfather was at this time. And being bound out or farmed out, you were sent to live with a family, and being bound out, you were with the intent of learning a skill, so that ultimately you could become independent. And Stagg's father was bound out to a shoemaker, again, a very prominent craft, small industry in the area. Oftentimes, and if you read descriptions of what the lives of these young people, what their lives were like, it is pretty miserable. So you could maybe get a nice family or one that treats you more as a servant or someone, because you often too, families bid to have these young people come to live with them, and young girls would be taught domestic skills, and the young boys would be taught either, if they lived on a farm, agricultural skills, or more in town, hat making, shoemaking, typical of the period and the era. Now, ironically, his mother, Stagg's mother, Eunice Pearson, she was, with her maiden name, she was a descendant of the most prominent family to settle, of the colonial planters to settle in Orange. And economically, she and her future husband, Stagg's father, they met. They ended up at the same economic level due to the incoming industrialization and the changes taking place in industry and craftsmanship. So, but Stagg's ancestry, there's a duality there of his mother's side coming from the most prominent leaders in the church, economically stable and having that status in the name, and then his father's side really coming from impoverishment and really unable to trace part of the lineage, which was very important, and you find it noted in Stagg's biographies, particularly at Yale. They talk about his mother's side, and then they really say his father can't be traced back but beyond one generation, which there was a certain amount of shame associated with that as well. And so the kind of the irony of that is that it would have been his mother's ancestors that would have been determining the fate of his father and determining that would have been the overseers of the poor. So, and as Stagg's growing up in Orange, New Jersey, that you have, too, a dramatic change taking place with the influx of immigrants in the 1840s through the 1860s. So the Stagg family economically was very poor, and then they experienced a shift in the demographics of their town. So culturally and religiously, they would have identified certainly with the haves, if you will, the Protestants that they lived near. But economically, more and more, they were living amongst the have-nots and this immigrant influence. And Stagg, there are many that he comments on that, of what that was like and the association with that. So there is this duality with Stagg of being of an economic class and of a different cultural class. And we see this as being very much a motivation for him and feeding his ambition to establish himself and to come out of that economic class. And he uses sport to do that. So, if we look at that, the reality of his origins, that it is quite unusual, although not unheard of, for someone of those origins to end up at a college prep school and then end up at Yale University, and certainly as a tenured teacher at the University of Chicago, that this is quite, it's not unheard of necessarily, but quite unusual path for him to have taken. Again, something else that's going on in the late 19th century, that because of the changing nature of work with industrialization and urbanization, more and more sons were unable to follow in their father's footsteps. Many of the jobs, Stagg's father himself as a cobbler, he had to give that up. That disappeared, particularly after the Panic of 1857. And he, in later censuses, lists his occupation as farm laborer. And Stagg worked with his father on those kind of jobs frequently. So it's quite unusual, but Stagg did, time after time, we see evidence of personal ambition. West Orange did not have a high school. The high school of Orange charged a tuition for people that did not live in that area, and Stagg paid his way with his father's approval through high school, and he didn't start pitching there, but he was the star pitcher for the Orange high school team. So a lot of sacrifice and ambition on his own part. Phillips Exeter was very interesting. Stagg was very friendly with a boy named George Gill in West Orange. And George was the son of a very prominent businessman who would ultimately become mayor of West Orange. And Stagg talks about getting letters from George, who was at Phillips Exeter, saying, come on, come along to Phillips Exeter. You can, they'll prepare you to get into Yale. Both George Gill and Stagg had expressed a desire to go to Yale, but did not have all the prerequisites that were necessary. And so George is writing, come on, and you can play, you can pitch here, and there's a lot of boys on scholarship. So it's not clear. Stagg does go on to Phillips Exeter. I wasn't able to document it in Stagg's case, but there are a lot of examples of benefactors of the town that would take a boy under their wings, another family, and perhaps sponsor them. Stagg could have also been a scholarship student because he lived very modestly at Phillips Exeter, but he did excel in sports, and he was only there a year, went there early in 1884, and by that fall he is at Yale. Has made up the deficiencies that it's not exactly clear what deficiencies and how that compensated for that, but he played baseball there, was very popular.
Athletes always had a faster route.
the fast track. And certainly that was his ticket. That's not to say he didn't have other skills, personal skills and ambition that were very important, but he didn't have the family name, he didn't have those credentials that would have made it very easy for him to access, say, Yale University or Yale College at the time and become a university, where it wasn't always smart, certainly, but he did not have those status or economic credentials, and really the athleticism played an important role. He was 21 years old when he entered Exeter, and although, again, that's not it's not extraordinary, but he was older, and at Yale, when he enters Yale at his first year, he is the fourth oldest in the class, and he's about 3 years older than the average student entering Yale. So he it took him a little bit longer, again, not having that smooth path for him to make these jumps and stepping stones. By the time he gets to the University of Chicago in 1892, he's 30 years old, and he talks a lot about really wanting to start his life's work, that this is a huge pressure on him because he stayed at Yale for 6 years. He was already an older student, and then you add on 2 extra years where he was graduate general secretary at the YMCA at Yale, that he's very anxious in 1892 to get a career, that he talks about how most of the men his age have started their life's work. So that also played a role in his self-image, if you will, or his expectations of that. So he arrives at Yale in the midst, and really right at the beginning of this tremendous sports revolution. Camp was at Yale. Camp would coach Stagg ultimately in football. But when Stagg arrives at Yale, two of the first things he does is he signs up for the YMCA, signs the roster for Dwight Hall, what would be Dwight Hall within 2 years. And he certainly signs up for baseball. But his reputation here has preceded him. He is made immediately captain of the class of 88's baseball team. So we see immediately where his 2 great interests lie, that he enters Yale as a divinity student and with the intention certainly of playing baseball. And we, again, calling that athletic Christianity, which is present from the beginning with Stagg. He plays baseball at Yale for 6 years, and he pitches Yale to 5 consecutive championships. Some of the organizations, certainly of the league that they're playing, it fluctuates greatly. Sometimes it's just Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Sometimes Amherst and Brown are added to that. And through that period, it isn't set or organized as much or to the degree that we see organized sport today. But it was extremely significant, and he was really known throughout the country as the premier collegiate pitcher of his era. And as I have said before, that there are those that argue that he would still, he would have to be considered one of the best of all time, not just of that era. And I have just a couple of quotes about Stagg at Yale and his baseball prowess. Author and professor William Lyon Phelps, who was the class of 1887, called Stagg the greatest college pitcher that Yale and the country had ever seen. Phelps never saw a man with such a memory for the weaknesses of the men he faced. And, these were pitchers that started the game and ended the game. We didn't have short and long relievers at that time. And so and they had difficulties finding catchers for Stagg as well. That could become problematic and was an issue up here at Chautauqua later. As Stagg pitched Yale past her rivals, Harvard and Princeton, 5 years in a row, and he played for 6, Harvard grew tired of meeting him and wondered if he would ever graduate. And so that issue of, Camp was another one who seemed to have, a decade career in college athletics. And the history of the tramp athlete that we've seen, throughout the periods where these guys change their name or, they're 30 years old, suiting up with the 17-year-olds. And Phelps continued, I was sorry he did graduate, but I do not know how he did. He played baseball all the time, and when he was captain, he developed 5 freshmen so that after he got through, those men would play on and on. A professional pitcher of the day gave his analysis of Stagg's talent. He weighs no balls at all. His methods ensure his comparative immunity against an overworked arm. And reportedly, these methods that this pitcher refers to included an arsenal of several different pitches, which was quite unusual for that time for one person. I haven't been able to find any more detailed information about how many pitches or how many different kinds of pitches Stagg threw. But he does talk in his autobiography of before going to Exeter or eventually Yale, developing his own curveball and throwing that as a younger man and being known for that. So we think of Stagg as the famous football coach, and really his roots, baseball was primary athletically. They tried to get him to play football, and he plays sporadically, and he sometimes suited up. But it's not until he starts as a graduate student or finishes his undergraduate degree that he starts to play more and more football. And obviously was very good, very skilled at it because he does make Camp's early All-American team. But really baseball was his love at this time, and really baseball was what brought him here to Chautauqua and what he did up here. As I mentioned before, before I move on to that, when we tie in this Christianity, I have to just briefly talk a bit about an experience at Yale that he had. In 1887, which would have been the year before he came to Chautauqua the first time, a professor, Henry Drummond, came to visit Yale. He was touring Eastern colleges. And Drummond was from Scotland at the University of Glasgow. He was a professor of natural sciences. And he was a devout and a strong Christian who believed in evolution and the sciences. So he was most known for reconciling or bringing these two together. It was very popular. The book he published in 1883, I think, was called Natural Science in the Spiritual World, or something to that effect, but overtly and purposely bringing science together with religion. Well, he visits Yale and goes out to recruit the leaders on the college campus, and specifically he targets the athletes as well, not just the scholarship leaders or those that were the most popular, but specifically the athletes. And Stagg is one of these chosen by or identified by Drummond to do Christian work on the college campus and perhaps beyond. And Stagg Drummond organized deputations where these young men would go out and, again, on campus recruit others for the purpose of evangelizing or witnessing and devoting their life to Christ. Stagg was part of this first class of deputations, and he traveled all throughout New England, giving talks to young men and using his sports background and stories of his sport to illustrate his point and to speak his point. Drummond, just as a kind of a description, and I just love the image that this evokes and what he was trying to do. He really rejected the kind of fire and brimstone or any kind of negative or any kind of message of punishment of God or really any negativity. He tried to do away with that. He didn't even want these students to talk about theology or doctrine. He wanted them, again, as symbols of who they are and these leaders on campus to simply talk about their life and their experience and their devotion to having given their life to Christ. So this is a Yale student writing when a deputation came to Princeton, was received from Princeton. They had been carefully chosen by Drummond. One was Winthrop M. Daniels, valedictorian of his class. One was Robert M. Spear, member of the football team, who was to have a splendid career in the ministry. The third was the most famous football player in the country, Hector Cowan, who could not make a speech, but who was a national hero in athletics. Cowan, an enormous fellow, stood up with sweat running down his face. There was much curiosity to hear what he would say. He stood looking at us a long while, overcome with stage fright. Then he said, "I feel more at home on the football field than making a speech, and I guess that'll be about all," and sat down. But the sacrifice that didn't matter. But the sacrifice he had made in coming and his evident sincerity made a deep impression. So this is what Drummond wanted. And Stagg, and I've heard this time and time again, that the reason Stagg chose not to go into the ministry or pursue a career in the ministry is he overheard a leader of the YMCA movement say, "Oh, he's a great guy, but if only he could speak, if only he could do public speaking." And Stagg himself talked about this later. But his early life, his descriptions of, he does talk about severe stage fright and anxiety. But then afterwards, and he's writing to his sisters, other people, how he wowed the crowd and they were with him from the beginning. And, you can imagine just his presence alone. But he spoke all over the country and he gave lectures, and I'll come back to that. But there, I don't know if it's, when we create our own kind of mythology of our past of how we got from A to B, if that's part of it. But really the popular mythology, and you'll hear it all the time, is, "Oh, his dad couldn't speak, otherwise he would have been in ministry, someone told him he couldn't." And there really is no evidence for that, particularly in this period, that he was an enthusiastic speaker and very popular, and oftentimes noted, how well the speeches went. So this happens, this really important event happens in his life, and he talks a lot about what an impression Drummond made on him and how deciding that his life's work would be working for Christ and doing this kind of work. And now, the following summer in 1888, he comes to Chautauqua for the first time. And as I said before, it's Yale professor William Rainey Harper that he kind of follows to Chautauqua, as did Yale athletes before him that were involved in the physical education or athletics here at Chautauqua and would continue afterwards. One of the reasons also that I wanted to talk about this here at Chautauqua is that I'm struck when we come at the beginning of the week and the banners on the stage where it's education, religion, arts, and recreation, that we kind of take that up, recreation, what does that mean? And in the history of Chautauqua, it was extremely important component, not just the availability of people to recreate as we have more so today, that's encouraged in the lake and the boats and the tennis courts, that it's pretty obvious that's available to Chicagoans. But in the late 19th century, this was a purposeful part of the curriculum. And before I get too much into Stagg, I want to just read a list of coursework that was available during the years that Stagg was here. And this is in the Department of Physical Education here at Chautauqua. By the end of Stagg's visits here, that the coursework, it was a 2-year course that people could take. And coursework was as I said, lengthened to 2 years. It had 6 faculty members and 20 special instructors. And they covered the subjects of anatomy, physiology, hygiene, orthopedics, anthropometry, not sure what that is, physical diagnosis, emergencies, light and heavy gymnastics, Delsart gymnastics, Swedish gymnastics, boxing, fencing, swimming, boating, lawn tennis, athletics, baseball, and rope splicing. So, I mean, was a tremendous program, and Chautauqua really, and I hope Joan she's going to have a few words for us later today as well, might make some comments to this, that it was very much developed, very much, if we can use a modern term, on the cutting edge. And I think this was a great influence on Stagg as well, and what he brought to the University of Chicago, and the people that he insisted on hiring, and the things that he wanted in place, in place there at Chicago for the students, and this assessment, this physical assessment of every student that came in. Classes, he taught classes at U of C in hygiene and health. People wrote him all his life about ailments that they had. What should I do? What would you do for this? And Stagg also suffered from chronic pain his entire adult life, and he traveled all over to Battle Creek and Kellogg and out to Colorado to different, they call them sanitariums, but in search of a cure or relief. And that was somewhat different, that he was a little bit older then, but they did look to him as not simply a coach or an athlete, but as a general, and they called it at U of C the course in physical culture. It wasn't physical, really, education, referred to as physical education at U of C at that time. So Chautauqua, I strongly think that he was so influenced by this and this coursework available to him. And I think Chautauqua in general, that we see how much a part of the program or the curriculum, if you will, that was here in the late 19th century. Well, that first year that Stagg came to Chautauqua, he came as the captain/coach of the baseball team. He also was asked to teach the game to those interested parties, the Chautauquans that were anxious to learn baseball. And Chautauqua made quite a deal of promoting, if you want to play baseball with the premier baseball player, come to Chautauqua. Yeah, I mean, they definitely made the most of that as well. And again, a further testament to the skill of Stagg and his name at that time. Now, there's a problem for athletes, particularly those that would ascribe to Victorian beliefs and values, and that was one of amateurism and having to keep your amateur status. And that's not to say that a lot of athletes didn't fudge on that, but you at least had to appear as if you were keeping your amateur status. And the definition of amateurism, which we inherited and shaped or made particularly distinctively American, we inherited from England, it really was a means of distinguishing or separating the upper classes from the rest of us. That it was a way of saying, if you've done these things, you are no longer an amateur. So if you received money for competition, or a prize, or if you were coached by a professional coach, someone who took money for coaching. Or if you, money, a prize, an award, coaching. I think those are the three main things. And again, this definition was used in many of the athletic clubs that are developed in the country, starting in the 1860s with the New York Athletic Club, and they're the ones really to put this definition in right. And so it wasn't hard for the elites to follow this. They didn't have to think about it, but it could be very hard for someone who was not to access that. And once you lost your amateur standing, you could no longer compete at that level or with those clubs. Now that begins to erode pretty quickly because winning becomes more important than some of these class distinctions. And a lot of these clubs, as they're competing against each other, they want to win. So they might take in a nice Irish Catholic boy who's particularly fast, and they don't pay him to run, but they give him maybe room and board. Okay, so they're not getting paid to do that. Well, on the college campuses, the problem is it's easy with football players because there's no place else for them to play. There's no professional game to speak of until the 19-teens, but really the 1920s, so that's long ways away. But baseball, the professional game, was already very much in place, 1870s, very popular game. And it also was the premier or most popular game on college campuses until the very late 1880s when football begins to eclipse that. But baseball is the game, and it exists at the professional level and at the college level. College players are playing baseball in the spring. Professional baseball is being played in the summer. And lots of opportunities and lots of temptations to play this. And also there were a number of amateur or semi-pro traveling summer teams that would come out of resorts or small communities. Stagg played for several years for the Bergen Point baseball team. And again, there's a lot of letters to Stagg saying, we can make this worth your while. And Stagg would say, I can't receive. But they would get lodging and they would get food. Stagg always says he never accepted money, but there are a few receipts in his scrapbook that look like he, I don't know what he did with it, or it didn't describe what the money was for. And I'm sure that would be explained that it was for housing, or I don't know. But that's something that his love of keeping everything. I mean, he's got a well-documented life that might have backfired on him a bit. But anyway, coming to Chautauqua, he was being hired to teach the game of baseball. So that did not upset his amateur standing. Yet he could still play and compete and had a place to stay, and food to eat. And so this was perfect for him at that level. But it also certainly complemented the Christian side of him, or the desire to do Christian work. And Stagg would also lead prayer meetings on Sunday, and he would attend Bible study courses during the week. And again, you can imagine how popular that must have been. Stagg's leading a prayer meeting, particularly for young people and even adults. I mean, they talk about, and I've read in some of the Chautauqua dailies that I go down to the archives and read, that the grandstands, baseball was played pretty much every day. I'm sure it wasn't played on Sunday, but during the week, 4 to 6 p.m. And it might be an inter-squad game or a team from around the area, and everyone went down there. And they said the ministers, the egghead professors, the young, the old, women and men. And so, what a popular activity, to walk right down and see some, and Stagg certainly the best pitcher in the country, but it wasn't just Stagg as well. Many of these, Stagg would try and bring up his whole team. In 1888, he had to start here at the beginning of the season catching because they didn't have a catcher that could catch his pitches. And they were 4-0, but then Jesse Dan arrives, and the famous Yale Battery is here at Chautauqua. I mean, it was, for sports fans, sports enthusiasts, or even, fans of celebrity. And again, if we're looking at mainstream Protestant Victorian culture, although they might have, kept one eye on the professional standings, that really wasn't acceptable. That game, young Protestant men weren't supposed to become professional baseball players. So for this audience here at Chautauqua and for that Victorian culture, I mean, these would have been the heroes or those that attracted the most attention. So Jesse Dan arrives, and now we've got Stagg pitching and Dan catching Stagg. And interestingly enough, at Yale, Dan started out as a pitcher, but no one could catch him. So he got moved to catcher. It was kind of an interesting switch here. And that 88 team here at Chautauqua, they were 10-1 that first year. And so the other, scene, if you've ever been in a city where your team is winning, and they're winning so much, we know this in Chicago with the Bulls, that you go and expect a win. It's kind of a neat feeling. It doesn't happen that often. So Chautauquans, they were going to go see their team win. So that was, a really extraordinary feature that they had here, the most famous college athlete. As I said, those interested in learning baseball and playing baseball went down from 4 to 6 every day. And just another little statistic from that year, that first year they went 10-1. Stagg's batting average was the highest, and he was batting .474 that summer. So you're seeing a lot of hits too. I talked to my students about, imagine, and again we can make some parallels with perhaps Michael Jordan, but when they went to see Babe Ruth, Babe Ruth, everyone loved Babe Ruth. And they went to see him hit home runs, and the expectation was so high that they would, it was pretty good chances that they were going to see Babe Ruth hit a home run. I think the first year that he, what was his stat? But he hit more home runs than all the other team totals combined. One person. So that expectation and that thrill to be repeated was quite appealing, and the promotion of the sport of baseball as well.
That was 1921.
Was it 21? Where he hit 54 or something, and that was more, 52 or 54, it was more than all the other teams combined.
Well, since Mark broke this up here, a little local history, Erin, excuse me.
Yes.
But in Celeron, which is just down the road here, 1921, the expectation was so high. He came on a barnstorming tour after the World Series, came here to Celeron, played one game, and the banner headlines, Ruth fails to hit homer. So, sorry, but you hit the nail right on it.
That's true. I was, I remember, I think it was Mark McGuire when he first started, that I remember wanting to go, and people talked about, let's go see someone hit home runs. It's a different mentality, and that I can't think of other players that you could really go.
The real record, though, is Ted Williams, who hit a home run once every 9 times at bat.
Really? I was not aware of that. But that is a different mindset. It's like surprise when one happens, but to go and say, ooh, this could be the one. Instead of crossing your fingers. So anyway, that same expectation was placed when Stagg or Yale performed, and you saw these premier athletes. The next summer, there was no catcher for Stagg. He couldn't pitch. No one could catch him. But it's remained a very popular game. As I said, the crowds, continue to come, and they describe them in all of the variety that would come. And Stagg, early on, enters Chautauqua lore as a living and present being. It wasn't after his death. And forgive my interpretation, but here is a poem about Stagg that was printed in the Chautauqua Daily. He steal, indeed that cannot be. Nay, tell me not, you did not see him steal. Why, man, he is as true as any lad I ever knew. He stole and died, and you are glad. Great Caesar fellow, you are mad. But someone cuffed me, yes, I heard that Stagg stole second and died on third. So here, it's pretty clear. Everyone knows who this gentleman is, and he's very popular. He liked to sing. He talked about at Chautauqua going to parties with girls. Now, I don't know what that meant. In those days, the socials probably at one of the homes, maybe that was hosted. Have you run across what those would have, if those would have been organized or official?
I imagine they were probably organized.
Yeah, this was in a letter to his sister, but he really, it was pretty clear that he enjoyed his time here.
What year was it home from?
I believe, I have to look at my notes, but I believe that is from the summer of 1889.
Which I think was the same year if Casey hit the bed.
Oh, really?
I think they loved writing those sports poems back then.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, I hadn't extended it beyond Chautauqua and look at it more as, if you get a poem written about you and while you're living and while you're there, is pretty extraordinary indicator of what your status is in that area. But that'll be interesting to see what the date of that was. As I said, he conducted religious meetings here. Those are popular. And he also, tennis was a big sport. Stagg loved to play tennis his whole life. And here at Chautauqua, in all the tournaments, he entered singles men, doubles men, and the mixed doubles. He loved it, and he really took tennis seriously. And his wife, who he would meet at the University of Chicago, she also was a tennis player, and they competed together there. And so he was a lifelong. And he also was a big promoter of sports that you could play all your life. Golf, he was also a big golfer, but did not have much time to play that, but he promoted those activities for that athleticism should be a lifelong activity and commitment. Another, in 1890, he appeared, he had a lot of diverse interests, and he is, this is, in 1890, he's 28 years old, he's single. Not that is too extraordinary, but when he gets to U of C, as he gets a little older, that becomes more of an issue. But he's older than a lot of his peers, if not, maybe by a handful of years. But he, I think, also was interested in pursuing all these different, the singing. He pursued that at Yale and here at Chautauqua. And he also took part in a dramatic rendition of the Ben-Hur tableau here at Chautauqua, if I could find this. And yes, one summer Stagg participated in a dramatic presentation of the Ben-Hur tableau. And my understanding as of these tableaus is that they're recreations. You're not acting or moving around. You are posing as if it was a painting. They do it in Laguna Beach. You think of that arts festival. Well, this apparently was. So they would recreate these scenes, and the lights would come on or whatever, the curtain.
Someone would read.
Oh, and someone would read the description of what that scene depicted. So this was to a standing room only crowd. And playing the part of Ben-Hur, of course, Stagg, he brought the production to its glorious climax. The audience were brought to intense but suppressed excitement. I thought that was so intense but suppressed. Polite excitement. Civilized excitement. And the victorious Ben-Hur, urging with flying lash his red-nostrilled steeds over the prostrate body of Masala, cheer after cheer burst forth. So,
Just looking at him, he probably wasn't wearing a shirt. They were so excited.
that's right. Do you? I have to get that when I publish that dissertation.
Was he good looking?
He was very good looking, but imagine he was only 5'4".
Oh, really?
And 158 pounds, so he was built like, real and very svelte, but all up in the shoulders and the chest.
He weighed what?
158 pounds, I believe.
So that's a lot for a smart.
It was real simple, but he wasn't, well, I'm not going to look it up now, but I do have that. Because he, again, upon entering Yale, he had to be assessed physically for his health and fitness. You know, again, that this was part of a larger trend as well on college campuses. In 1892, Stagg, at this time with Chautauqua, to 1 year while he's here, he directs 3 different summer programs in 3 different areas, 2 weeks each, so in high demand. And another thing that he did here was to lecture on, and this was 1892, this is really the last summer that he's here, to lecture on the modern athlete. And this was a slideshow presentation with slides and a lantern that he developed at Springfield College. And reportedly, Luther Gulick at Springfield would run the lantern for him sometimes for the slides. But again, and you can see Drummond's influence and the influence of Chautauqua with his emphasis on recreation and the physical education of the body. And then he's at Springfield College, where Gulick really kind of puts to sophistication that inverted triangle of the YMCA, where it is the spirit, which is at the top, but it's a spirit that is supported by the mind and the body. So you see the heavy religious connotations of that, but also the equality of importance of the body and mind. So Stagg, all these factors are very, very key to understanding, again, the most significant influences on Stagg and on what he does and what direction he takes. So this lecture on the modern athlete that he brought here to Chautauqua very much involved the science of the day, and some of it popular science, and certainly some of it has been, by history, discredited as unscientific. But for that day, he was using the knowledge of the day, very much incorporating it into this idea of an ideal of athleticism. And the lecture talked about the importance of, and again, this is 1890s, and we're talking about it in the 1990s or 1980s, that the importance of all-around training. And Stagg's got this down, and symmetry and harmonious development. So it's not focusing, how many of you have seen or looked at The Inner Game of Tennis? You remember that book from the 70s, early 80s, where they talked about, see the ball, be the ball. I mean, it was a terrific book, but it was all the mental side of athletics and performing, and we all have read many accounts of team psychologists and, traveling. They don't just have the trainer and the guy that patches you up in the middle of the game and sends you back out, but they also have the psychologist that is working on the mental aspect of the game. And certainly this was a precursor of this and what Stagg was talking about. But the mental more so being the spiritual in his, that if you have that will help you. He talked about after hearing Drummond that he started to say a prayer before every game. And he even talked to youth saying he was saying prayers before every pitch. And so that incorporation of the spiritual / mental, if you will, that tying into the modern era. I think I'll stop there because I wanted to give Joan a few minutes, and then if we had discussion or questions, kind of wrap up with that. But again, the idea of that Chautauqua and the contribution Chautauqua made to Stagg and his direction, and certainly the role that he played here, I think it's important for Chautauqua not to forget that part of its history, and things kind of go in ebbs and flows, but that recreation really was not something necessarily that you did on the side or after work, or that it really was an important component of that. And again, we can tie that into some of the things that are being talked about now, you know, whether it be motivational speakers, that balance. And I think that they anticipated this or valued that or attempted to make that a part of our life, if for only, you know, the summer at Chautauqua. But Stagg was much more than simply a skilled athlete and known for more than that, although we associate him so much with college football. But that really his expertise in going beyond athleticism and his interest in that and the development of that. I think that the coaching of the football completely overshadowed the demands on his time. Very quickly at U of C, he stops teaching hygiene courses, he stops lecturing on the scientific approach, and then you see a book come out, The Scientific Approach to Football, and really football starts to take over all his time and efforts. But really there was another, you know, a whole part of his life that fits so much into this mid-19th century muscular Christianity and into that athletic Christianity that one journalist called it. Stagg really gives us the key to understanding that era for that particular culture and group. So, that,
Erin, when he was at the University of Chicago, was he able to continue the spiritual side?
You know, that he does have, from what I found, I could only find some really slight documentation of an early relationship with the YMCA at U of C. And he doesn't ever reject that notion, but you see him developing much more a secular application of athleticism or physicality, which would also be in keeping, though, with that turn of the century, that ideal of the strenuous life that is epitomized by Theodore Roosevelt. That it is a much more, it doesn't reject Christian values, but it is a much more secular application of that. And so that is really the path that he takes. You hear less of the religiosity of it and more of character building leaders. That it's a much more secular application, at least in the rhetoric. Now, he kind of moves through some denominations and moving from different churches. He ends up with the Baptist Church at U of C as a member of that church, you know, and those are the founders of the University of Chicago. And then when he's in California, and I'm not sure exactly, but it's a different church that he attends and ends up being interred or buried at. So his religious affiliation remains strong, but he's not a strict, he went from Presbyterian to Baptist to, I forget the next one, and that remains strong, and the values remain consistent, but the overt attachment or link to religion, that diminishes at the University of Chicago.
Did you realize that Drummond had been here?
I did, and I was trying to find out what date that was
Well,
to
I
see
had
if Stagg already knew him.
I had a delightful study on him that a woman in Buffalo did this year.
Really?
On Drummond.
Oh, great. Well, I'll have to, because I would need those dates to see, if Stagg had already known him.
He was
or-
here twice.
Great. Yeah, because
And about that time.
he was quite popular, and
Yeah.
his work was quite popular. Okay, well, that's Joan.
Well, I feel so honored with Alfreda here. and gee, this is really terrific. Thank you. First of all, I have some things I'm going to pass around, but I wore this shirt, and I'm going to talk about a course that I just sort of hit a few things on a course that I taught last year about early sports at Chautauqua. But last year, I discovered that Roque, which I'm going to talk about, is played in Angelica. And as far as they know, it's the only place in the whole United States where it's actively being played today. And I was there a few weeks ago, and of course it rained and they couldn't play because they're playing on a clay court and it was full of puddles. But it's right in the middle of the city. It's 2 hours from here. And they have the first weekend in August, their Heritage Days, where they will be playing the game and all sorts of. This town dates from 1800. and it's a real treat to go there. So you might want to do that. Roque comes from the word croquet, where you lop off the C and the T, and you get the word roque. And it's a combination of chess, croquet, and billiards. You see, it has walls, and so it's a combination of using the walls as billiards. Croquet early on began to wane a little bit. So around in 1900, roque became a highly skilled prized game, and they considered themselves very exclusive, the roque players. They had a club here. It originally started over by the library, and they had temporary walls at that point. Moved over to the ravine in about 1905, and the walls, the remains are still there. The walls are made of concrete. The court itself is 60 by 30, so it's smaller than a regular croquet court. And as I said, you play on clay. You play with a hard rubber ball and short mallets, so you have to lean over. They usually have one person on the court at a time because it's a fast game. And folks, it's a sexist thing. The court in Angelica was designed for men only. However, women now play it. But here they had 3 regulation courts, one woman's court, and a practice court. It went to the Olympics in the 1900s. It's the only Olympic event always won by the Americans. And we had the finest roque courts here in the East. There were 5 of them. We had the remains of 4 of them. So I will pass these around so you can see. This is a roque game actually in process here early on. They had their own little clubhouse. This is what we have of the remains of pictures I've taken. This is the upper one, which you can see quite easily because it now has a shuffleboard court down the middle of it and has our outdoor classroom on it, which you must visit with beautiful benches. So this is before the benches. This is the one that's down by the girls' club, and you can see the corner of the roque court sticking out into the creek. And unfortunately, last year, that corner fell off. So my hopes of restoring these, I think, has diminished. These are the picture of the other 2. As you walk up in the ravine, these are the remains of the walls for the other 2. So I've sort of become very interested in roque, and I hope someday we'll have a court restored here to play, like in Angelica. I'm passing around these magnets, which are old postcards, and on the bottom is a picture of a roque game, and across from it is my favorite building, which is no longer here. It was the university building over by the president's house. It had a very Moorish look, and it was raised. It was taken down in 1919. Up here on the top was where Stagg did some of his operations. This is the overlook over here, and this is looking out over the overlook. This is where his baseball stadium would have been in the corner here, and this building is the athletic club building, which is gone. That's replaced by the Beeson Center down there, but this was the old athletic club building. Also, the sports club, which you know is down by Palestine Park, the predecessor of the athletic club was the men's club. So you can see this. This is the fire in the colonnade early on, and some of the other pictures, which I'll pass around. But let me just give you a few highlights from my course. And I'm also going to pass around this wonderful map. Those of you who don't know, Chautauqua was the 2nd highest navigable, remember that word, navigable lake in the world. And this will give you some statistics on it, and that's why it was extremely popular in the sports that we had here. It was a very unique, and still today, unique kind of lake. I wanted to stress what Erin said about the university here. By 1883, we had chartered Chautauqua University as a liberal arts college, the first one in the United States. If you look at that picture from 1874 to that date, I mean, it seems like an impossible task. In 79, they had a school of theology and a school of languages. In 1886, the school of physical education that we were talking about. In 89, a school of music. 91, the first sewage treatment plant in our country, designed by Lewis Miller, the founder, down where the one is today. I mean, in 1878, the first homesteading extension course. I mean, it just seems amazing, doesn't it? I'm going to read you the early sports from 1875 to 1878. This is a listing of croquet, tennis, rowing, sailing, camping, balloon extensions, fireworks, the illuminated fleet out in the water, swings, fishing, yacht excursions, calisthenics, bathing, swimming, baseball, and strolling, which was considered wonderful. August 1876, 2 years after our founding. It was called Fairpoint still at that point. Fairpoint assumes leadership in everything that is attractive, innocent, and good. And while in its leading aspects it stood alone, without rival or a peer. The problem was to harmonize the spiritual, the intellectual, with rest, recreation, pleasure, and amusements, and at the same time exclude everything in the least degree that was tinged with immorality. Croquet playing must be recognized as among the most pleasing amusements of this place. As an outdoor exercise in which social life and the skills of the players are pleasantly mingled together, we know of nothing that is more free from all evil and more promotive of recreation and pleasure. So there's your aspect again. By 1879, they had a normal school, which included some of the things that she mentioned, and now crew had become very big here. And I'm happy to say that women were part of the crew races here early on. There's pictures of them, which is very rewarding to see that. By 1881, they had a school of physical education and a bicycle school, which is my special interest, archery, horseshoes, quoits, a roller skating rink, a roller coaster. We have pictures of the roller coaster. It's wonderful. It went 80 miles an hour. At Chicago. Polo games, a marine bicycle, which is at the Bicycle Museum in Orchard Park, a copy of it, but an old one, actually. Folk dancing, massage, and something called Del Sart. Del Sart was basically for women, and it was to connect, and that's something you should get into, connecting the body, the mind, the spirit, and all of it. And there's some wonderful pictures of that too. By 1890, the Seaver Gym had been created with, who knows how many courses. I won't read them all for you. The men's club came in 1892, which I said was where the sports club was. Finally, they got the beautiful athletic club building in 1905. It included the rope courts, the bowling alleys, the tennis courts, the baseball diamond, the crew, the sailing, the swimming, the bathing, the fishing, nature study, camping parties, golf, lecture rooms, reading room, billiards, soccer, track and field, a pool, this kind of pool, archery, fencing, tumbling, wrestling, and boxing. From 1912 to 1920, I just think this is extraordinary. In the amphitheater, they had the following exhibitions: field day, aquatic day, tennis tournaments, well, some of those obviously were elsewhere, circus, crew races, playground festival, new bowling gym exhibition, and the saddle club. I mean, it just is amazing to me. They had in the upper ravine a playground for the children where the gym teachers did their practice teaching. And it was just, the children were just in heaven over in that area. And those playgrounds still show on the maps in 1940. So I'm not sure. We're not really sure when they stopped using them. Today we have the sports club, which is you're all aware of, and that includes the yacht club, aerobics, shuffleboard, badminton, ring tennis, dominoes, checkers, yoga, tai chi, ping pong, and Alfreda's husband was connected with the longboat, which you might want to go over. I'm going to read my last quote. Teddy Roosevelt in 1905 said, "There is probably no other one educational influence in this country quite so fraught with hope for the future of the nation as this, and the movement of which is its archetype." So we can be very proud of Chautauqua.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I neglected to read one, and on a humorous note, and then if we have questions, we can just take the last 10 minutes or so.
That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
As in addition to all the things that Joan and I listed earlier, one chronicler, recreation and fitness became so closely identified with Chautauqua, and I think that I'll have to get that quote from Teddy Roosevelt, but they were so closely identified with Chautauqua that one of its chroniclers joked that if the summer resort had a coat of arms, its symbol would be a dumbbell. Right. So I thought that was really interesting. That that was really how closely and how important fitness and recreation and athletics were to Chautauqua. Does anyone have any questions for either myself or Joan or Elfrida?
You know, what I told you on the speaking this morning, that Mr. Flanders, we discovered this winter by pouring through the daily proof that his grandfather was able to catch.
Was he for Stagg?
Stagg.
Which
and,
and I'll have to get that.
It was while William I. Phelps was playing, and when he came back, they had a reunion, and the picture is in, we published it in the Chautauquan Winter, and
They had a reunion here at Chautauqua?
yeah.
Oh, it's because Phelps, I know, was a little...
Stagg wasn't here,
Okay.
but William Ryan Phelps and Flanders, and but we found it in the paper, that he really was catching.
And during that time that Stagg was here?
Yes, oh yes, they were with the
That's
battery.
great. That's great. Probably, yeah, they said we have to have a different catcher after that one season where Stagg couldn't pitch. So that'll be interesting. That, and that's an important part of it too, that you collect, it is by bits and pieces, some of this is put together. But it is important to document it because it adds so much, not only to the understanding of Stagg, but what was going on in the late 19th century. And again, documenting how important athleticism and fitness was here really traces, because historians are always into finding the origins, where does it go, the provenance, if you will, where it goes back to. And you see, how it appears is they came up with all this stuff.
And also,
And they didn't.
you must remember William Anderson, who was head of that school of physical education. He was very important, I think.
That's very right. That's right.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I was just amazed how long Stagg lived when we talked to you the first day.
103.
103?
And I was saying
103
1863,
years old.
but it was 1862 that he was born. In the midst of the Civil War, and he lived through the Civil Rights Movement. It's quite extraordinary. That, well, he died in 65, but right after the two acts were passed, so that really before slavery ended officially, completely, and died at the peak, politically at least, of the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah.
We have another Exeter-Yale combination here with Shorty Folmsby, who has been the chief usher at church here for years.
Really?
And, he was a baseball coach at Exeter and coached George Bush, who of course later on was the captain of the Yale team.
I did not know that.
Sure. Yeah.
What is his name?
Shorty Fallensby.
George Folmsby. Which you'll admit.
So
He was captain?
Mark, there's another interview.
Captain of the baseball team? Is that what it
No,
was?
he was a coach.
Oh, he's a coach.
He went to Shadyside Academy in Yale, I think. And then he coached at Phillips Exeter, and he was George Bush's baseball coach in, let's say, 1939, 1940.
I'm going to have to come back before the end of the summer.
But this whole emphasis of spirit, mind, body, it was really what was here right from the beginning.
Right.
That was the ideal.
No, which is very important. That's right. And that Harper got that from here and brought it to U of C, and that it really preceded Springfield College. I mean, adopting it as its official philosophy, and that again, Chautauqua really has to be. I think in popular history or traditionally, it has been lumped with the rise of Protestant resorts and escapes out of the urban centers to areas, and that's really limiting on what its contribution really was to, that beyond seeing that as that late 19th century part of the establishment of country clubs, etc. That it's kind of been lumped with that, and it really, that's not where it fits properly, I think.
Two questions. Can you tell us anything about the University of Chicago moving? I mean, I don't think they have any interscholastic teams, so when did they move out of that? And the other question is, do you know details on how college football eclipsed college baseball in the 1880s?
I think part of it, that there were many factors, your second question, many factors that contributed to that. The existence of the professional game of baseball, and really that its rise in popularity already kind of eclipsed the college game, and it was limited, that the general public, and I said, I'm sure even Victorians frowned on their children becoming professional baseball players. That didn't necessarily keep them from being fans of the game, or at least paid attention to it. So the rise, the accelerated rise in the national game, that was part of it, that the college game didn't keep up with that. But also in the late 19th century, that there was a call amongst leading intellectuals, commentators, authors, of this idea of the moral equivalent to war, that the last of the Civil War generation was dying out, and where would the youth, the future leaders of America, learn these skills of sacrifice, cooperation, discipline, and that was part of it as well. Football epitomized that, and I think that's demonstrated, or that point is made even further when that crises of 1905, where so many young men were being killed on the football field, so much so that it attracted the attention of President Roosevelt, who called the Big Three, Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, Camp being the grandfather of football, or the father. I always forget what one Stagg is and what Camp is, but Camp came first. And Roosevelt brings them to the White House. What are we going to do about this? And it's never to discuss getting rid of football. That was never an option. It was to make it less deadly. Not even less dangerous, less deadly. And a lot of the defenders, including Camp, who wouldn't come out and say, we don't care if people are being killed. But the implication was that this is a price we have to pay, because this is the game that teaches these qualities. And they really, the game, 18 more people die that following year in football. And presidents of the universities then get together and say, that's it. Some universities temporarily get rid of football, some go to soccer, some go to rugby, and others work on reforming the game itself. And that is where you get the founding of the NCAA. It's called the IAA, that in 1906. In 1910, it changes its name to the NCAA. But the original purpose of the NCAA was specifically to look at rules and football rules and standardize those rules and make the game safer. So they focused on things such as the V formation, the down system, and really it was the beginning of the opening of the game up. It doesn't become a passing game overnight, but with some severe limitations, you start to have passing allowed. Too many punishments, too many risks, but that was the beginning of that evolution. So I think that football really symbolized for many Americans, not all of them, and again, it was a game played on college campuses. So until the founding of the state schools, state universities, and colleges, it remained somewhat of an elite sport for the future leaders of the country. That this is a valuable, this is a replacement for war, if you will. And so that's part of it. And then you will get a lot of, historians, sociologists commenting on how much football really is an expression of a larger culture, a larger personality, if you will, of the country. Maybe a different side than baseball, but I think that's part of it. And the first one, U of C and sport, again, Harper, with his ideal of that, really U of C is often called in its founding a service university, and that seems to be somewhat of a negative connotation, but Harper really, much like what he borrowed from extensively at Chautauqua, that reaching all aspects of not only the individual, but of people, and extension courses and the publications branch of the university, and the ability to correspondence courses for older students that didn't live near a university, and so athletics and physical fitness and physical culture, again, very much part of the curriculum. Stagg was very proud that you had to, as a prerequisite for graduation, you had to fulfill coursework in the Department of Physical Culture. And it was the only university to do that at that time. There were lots of ways to get around that, but it was in the books, and he was very proud of that. With the death of Harper, which was very premature, or he was very young when he died, in 1906, the subsequent presidents you see moving a little bit away with each president, and I'm generalizing here, but really that idea of the university servicing not only the individual, not only the community, but the country in a way, that it going much more toward the more German model of the research and science institution, and establishing, the medical schools, the law schools, and moving really away from that model that Harper promoted. And really the ultimate end was, with standards increasingly get higher and higher, and Stagg struggles, as all athletic departments do, with the standards of the university. But as it becomes its reputation is more and more built on the research end of it, it is harder and harder for him to get students and find ways to bring them to the university. So that's part of the problem. So there's a kind of a natural decline as standards rise. But it was the presidency of William Maynard Hutchins. And he comes in the early 30s and really forces Stagg to retire at the age of 71. Right, yeah, 71. And Stagg had become increasingly combative with students, and students wanted to organize and have a say in the athletics, and Stagg tried to take over the intramurals, which was something he wasn't thrilled about, 40 years before even establishing, and he's losing ground there, and he's losing control of the money, and the money's not coming in, and it seemed to be a very uncomfortable situation. But Hutchins, and I said this yesterday in class, and many people, this quote has been attributed to many people, but Hutchins, one of the ones that I think it's associated most closely with, he supposedly said, when I feel like exercising, I lie down for a while and the feeling goes away. So he did not see an association at all between higher education and intercollegiate athletics. He did not see a relationship at all. He didn't know, he felt they had nothing to do with each other. And again, collegiate athletics, I mean, even in the 1890s, they were, football particularly, that was a highly commercialized sport with many of the characteristics of professional sport. So that debate had been going on since then of over-commercialization and professionalization. But Hutchins, by 1939, football is gone at the University of Chicago. And now they do have a football team today. They play other research institutes. They travel to Calgary, the Egghead League or something. I forget. There's a kind of a popular.
Didn't they just win a championship though?
No.
They didn't Chicago?
Did they?
U of C.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Didn't they just-
It might have been. It's a very small. It's like MIT, U of C, Cal, Tech. No, Northwestern.
Why did you stick to Northwestern?
Oh.
Maybe it's Northwestern that won. isn't it?
Yeah, Northwestern.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
all right.
Yes.
I just was thinking, was Chautauqua unique as far as letting women be in sports?
Maybe Alfreda went into that too.
They actually, immediately, they opened everything to co-education.
Oh, they did?
There. Yes,
Uh-huh.
that was one of the great things that they did for women.
Hmm.
See, and that is something else the University of Chicago gets credited an awful lot of. That Harper here,
Yeah,
all those influences we can tie back.
and there were great classes for women in the school, physical education here. Everybody took some kind of a
Right.
course at the school.
And the women's military thing was very important here. When they
Well,
had-
that was just during the First
well, during the
World War.
war, they had an encampment.
Yes, they had the, I never did quite understand that.
Well, I was denied crew when I first started college. It was here. It was here before 1900. for women.
Hmm.
So you could come here and be on crew, but not.
But where were you denied that?
At Marietta College. Women are rowing now, but they weren't. They have a very good crew. And they sunk Navy one year.
Well, thank you all. The time is up, and I appreciate everybody.
Yes.